Thank you, thank you. So yes, I'm Charity Grace Mofsen. I'm the Associate Director of Nantucket Operations for the Museum of African American History. We are based out of Boston. We have two different campuses, obviously in Boston, and then we have our campus here on Nantucket. So I really appreciate you all having me today, and I'm hopeful that you'll learn something that you can take with you. And also that will compel you to come and visit us over at our site as well. So the Museum of African American History was first established back in the 60s in Boston, but we've been on Nantucket since the late 80s, early 90s, when the restoration first began on the African Meeting House. So if you've gone past Five Corners recently, and by recently I mean like in the past 5 years, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of work going on over there. Good news is that we can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Everything will be completed by the end of this year. So if you happen to be around during Stroll Weekend, we'll have a big event that will have everything open. We have the African Meeting House, and for those of you who don't know, there are actually 4 additional structures to the right of the African Meeting House, and so 2 of those have been restored and the other 2 are currently being worked on as we speak. So absolutely. Oh, just kidding. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about community. We all like to think of Nantucket as this magical, whimsical island, or at least I do, but it's not perfect, and that's okay because no place is. One of the things that makes Nantucket so special, though, is that there have always been good people here willing to speak up when their voice was needed. Good people working together to make Nantucket into this wonderful island that we've all fallen in love with. So we have countless examples of Nantucketers working together as a community very early on. The fact that we had a predominantly African American community of free blacks, not only able to form, but thrive during a time that slavery was still legal in our country. The fact that that's what was happening here on Nantucket, it really, I think it speaks volumes about not only the people who were here, but the mentality, because as we know, even today, there will always be issues that we have to work through, but when we have those the basic foundation that says that we're all here, we all want to be here, you know, and we're all going to take care of each other. So that's something that's been here since the very early days of Nantucket. So the neighborhood around the African Meeting House was being established as early as the 1730s, okay? It was known as New Guinea. And what we now call Five Corners, that busy intersection that everybody loves, it was once known as Pompey's Corner. It was named after Captain Pompey. He was a whaler. He was obviously also African American, and so when you look at this history and when you go in that area, you'll start to kind of see things like New Guinea, Angola Street, and these are evidence, basically, hints showing where these people were originally brought from, who populated this neighborhood. So the neighborhood was made up of everything one might think is necessary for a community to be self-sufficient. You had shops, you had inns, they even had a dance hall, which I like to throw that out there because even today we don't have a dedicated, spot where people are getting dressed up and going and dancing, outside of the chicken box. Most importantly, there were people here, people who cared about each other and cared about their community. The people who lived here contributed to their community both directly and indirectly. They owned homes, they started businesses, they were weavers, they were homemakers, preachers, innkeepers, whalers, community leaders. These people would work together and with the rest of the island, whites, blacks, natives, all working together over the years to accomplish great things like the integration of schools as early as the 1840s. Leading up to that was one of our favorite events. So I'd like to take this time to tell you one of our stories that deals directly with community, and I think it's a great example for us to be able to look back at and apply to our lives today. So, has anyone heard of Arthur Cooper? Anyone? Okay, great, perfect. So Arthur Cooper was a gentleman who escaped slavery in Virginia. So think early 1800s on Nantucket. Slavery is no longer recognized. Like I said, the neighborhood here was being established as early as 1730. So this was a thriving, predominantly African American community by the time Arthur Cooper shows up. So he gets here, he gets involved right away, okay? So before the African Meeting House was built in 1825, there used to be another all-black church that stood, if you go towards the old mill. And so that's where Arthur Cooper was a preacher. And so he marries a woman who's already free. They start a family. They're these great contributing members of the community. And then after they've been here for a while, bounty hunters showed up looking for Arthur Cooper, okay? Now these bounty hunters, their plan was they were going to show up, they were going to go over to the Cooper's house early in the morning before the sun had come up, so the family would still be asleep, therefore unable to put up a fight. And their plan was they were going to take the entire family. Even though they only legally had a claim to Arthur, they're seeing dollar signs, okay? Arthur was married, remember? So he's got a wife, he's got 4 kids. His wife's pregnant with baby number 5, okay? So they're thinking they're gonna leave Nantucket rich if they can sell this entire family into slavery, okay? So they think that they're gonna be able to surprise this family if they show up like this. Now, how many of you live on Nantucket? If you've spent any amount of time on Nantucket, you probably know that word travels very fast here. There are very few secrets, okay? And if it's that way today, imagine back in the early 1800s, okay, we're talking 1822, okay? Imagine 1822, before there were as many distractions as we have today, okay? Everybody knew everybody, okay? They might not have known each other personally, but just like today, you know of someone, you know a portion of their story, right? So these guys, these bounty hunters, show up to Nantucket. They were probably barely off the boat before everybody on this island is talking. Everybody knows who they are, why they're here, who they're looking for, right? So there's no surprising anyone. But they didn't realize that, okay? Because they didn't understand Nantucket's community. So they still have their plan in place. So just imagine if you continued a bit further down Pleasant Street, eventually you'll come off to the left to Angola. That's where the Coopers lived, okay? So imagine about 5 o'clock in the morning, still dark outside, and these bounty hunters are marching over to take this family, all right? But instead, they were met by a mob of black people, okay? Now, some estimates as low as just over 100, all the way up to 180, okay? So we're talking about the large majority of the adult black population on the island at that time, okay? That's how fast word traveled, that even that early in the morning, people got up, got dressed, got organized, and they showed up, okay? They made sure that these bounty hunters weren't just gonna be able to walk in and take this family, while they're sleeping in their beds, right? Now here's what's really incredible about this story that I like to throw out here, okay? Now, yes, you had this black community coming together to defend one of their neighbors, right? But there weren't just black people out here, okay? There were lots of white members of the community who came out as well, all right? That's true Nantucket, all right? That's people coming out that knew that something was about to take place that they didn't agree with, that went completely against the values of this community here. And so even though it didn't necessarily affect them directly, they knew that it was important to speak up for the rest of their community members. So you've got this whole crowd of people out there. One of the people who was out there was Mr. Folger, who happened to be the local magistrate at that time, okay? And Mr. Folger, he flat out told these bounty hunters, he said, look, I'm fully aware of federal law and the fact that it supersedes our local laws here. However, this is not happening today, okay? You're not taking Arthur Cooper, okay? You're certainly not taking his wife and kids, who you have no legal claim to anyway. But if you don't leave now, I'll have you arrested myself, okay? That's how tight-knit this community was that early on. And that's not to say by any means that they didn't have any other issues to work through. But at the very foundation, they knew, these are my neighbors, okay? It wasn't rocket science for them, as it shouldn't be for us either today. They knew, living on this teeny tiny island, 30 miles out to sea, you need your neighbors. You need every single one of them, okay? And so I like to imagine that there were probably some people that maybe didn't like Arthur Cooper, right? But they said, you know what? He's my Arthur Cooper, okay? We know that long after you guys are gone, these are still my neighbors. These are still the people that I have to live with and work with, okay? So they were aware enough to know that the second they allowed somebody in here to start dividing up the community, the whole community would fall apart. It would not be as strong as it was. So those bounty hunters, they didn't leave right away, of course. They kept going around the island, hoping that somebody would talk. But that's another interesting part of the story anyway, though, because nobody talked, okay? Now, 1822, even though slavery was no longer recognized here, let's be realistic. You know, there had to be at least a couple of people that maybe still wanted that to exist. Or at the very least, people that were sticklers for the law and said, well, hey, you know, it's federal law. I might not like it, but it's federal law. Even they didn't talk, okay? These bounty hunters were going into pubs in particular for obvious reasons, right? People were a little drunk. Somebody's bound to have loose lips, right? Even the drunk people didn't talk, okay? So this sense of community that was here, even if it was unconscious, it was such a part of the people who lived here that even as early as the early 1800s, people were figuring out ways to work together and thrive together. So like I said, those bounty hunters, they left this island completely empty-handed. Nobody gave them any information, and it's one of the reasons why we think this is such a great example of what it means to be a community. You know, like I said, there's I'm sure that, you know, there were maybe people that didn't have a personal relationship with Arthur Cooper, and yet they stood up, they spoke up, they did the right thing. So another great story or a great example of community that we can find in our local history here is the story of Florence Higginbotham. Now, has anyone heard of Florence Higginbotham? A couple, few? Awesome. Okay, so I have to tell you, Florence Higginbotham, we talk a lot about her because of our property. The Seneca Boston Florence Higginbotham house is actually our oldest structure. Seneca Boston purchased the land in September of 1774 and began constructing his home shortly thereafter. Many years later, Florence Higginbotham shows up, purchased the house about 1920, and she is the reason why we have all those additional structures out there. So Florence started the preservation, we call it, of the Boston Higginbotham house. She basically changed everything. And then she had an old garage built, she had a cottage built, she had what was a chicken coop built, and then she eventually purchased the African Meeting House in 1933. So I love Florence Higginbotham. I could talk about her all day, but there is a point in me talking about her right now. So Florence originally came to the island. She was very young, and she wanted to be a chef. And she ended up getting this great job working for Mrs. Underhill out in Wisconsin on the other side of the island. Now, Mrs. Underhill was incredibly wealthy, older white woman. She and her husband had, I guess they did a lot of traveling in their day, and they would collect china. And the china that they purchased all over during their travels, they would decorate their cottages. They owned 30 cottages right on the water, and they would rent these cottages out to vacationers. So Florence Higginbotham is hired to be the main employee, all right? Well, by the end of a summer, Florence and Mrs. Underhill, they've developed a friendship, okay? So instead of Florence leaving to go back to the mainland, she stays because Mrs. Underhill had invited her to continue to work. So Florence meets a guy in the Navy, they get married, she gets pregnant. Unfortunately, this is during the time on the island where nobody was here. Nobody wanted to be here. Early 1900s on Nantucket, it's pretty much a ghost town. So mid-1800s, we'd been around 10,000 people. By the time Florence shows up, there's less than 3,000 people here. So for young people especially, I'm sure many of you have heard young people today complain about Nantucket and how there's nothing to do. I would like to remind them of the late 1800s, early 1900s, because I'm sure the young people back then, they were hating life because there wasn't nearly as much to do as there is today, especially during that time when no one was here. So, unfortunately, Florence's young husband heard about California, like a lot of other people did, and so he decided to go out to California. He wrote letters for a while, and then they stopped. So Florence was left as a young single mom. It's very sad. But fortunately, Florence was an incredibly strong woman, okay? She also had an incredibly strong support network with Mrs. Underhill, okay? So at that point, Mrs. Underhill, she said, "You're a young single mom. You need help. You're gonna move in with me," okay? Now this is why I bring up this story, because even with Nantucket being as progressive as it was, that was so taboo, okay? No one was having their employees live with them, okay? Especially if said employee was a black woman. That was not happening, okay? And yet, it happened. Mrs. Underhill said, yeah, she might be my employee, but she's also my friend, and she needs help. And so, she's gonna live with me. And so that's what happened. Florence and baby boy Will move in. They would spend summers on Nantucket, Wisconsin, and they'd go back to Waltham, Massachusetts the rest of the year. That went on for some time, and then Florence came across the old Seneca Boston house. So she purchased it, got to work, building all those other structures. By the way, she was doing that during the Depression, okay? This is when nobody really had the resources to do that, but she was incredibly resourceful. She made a lot of friends. She got involved in the community, okay? Now, at some point, Mrs. Underhill fell on hard times. Obviously, stock market crashed. Her husband had passed away. There was a fire. She lost a lot of her resources. And so, though she had previously been incredibly wealthy, things changed drastically. And so, by this point, she was well into her 80s. Health-wise, she needed a lot of help. So we saw a little role reversal, okay? Florence then invites Mrs. Underhill to move in with her over at the Boston Higginbotham house. And Florence became her caretaker for the rest of her life, okay? And so this is the history that brought me to Nantucket. I was completely blown away when I heard a lot of this stuff, but this story in particular, thinking about these two women from totally different backgrounds, you know, different ages, different races, different income levels, you know, during a time that for them to be as close as they were, it went completely against social norms. But they both had a sense of community about them, okay? They knew each one of them, each one of us has a very important role to play in our community, okay? And so it's important, sometimes we have to step up and help out because each one of us is very important here on this island. And so Florence, when she needed help, Mrs. Underhill was there for her. Years later, when Mrs. Underhill needed help, and she's contributed so much to this island, right? Florence said, you know what? You're my friend, and you need help now, so you're gonna move in with me. There's so many stories about when those women lived together in that home, different things that Florence would do to make sure that Mrs. Underhill was able to maintain some level of dignity in her last days. After Mrs. Underhill passed away, Florence, you can actually, if you're interested, on the NHA's website, you can actually access old recordings, people that grew up in the neighborhood during the time that Florence was alive, and they all got together some years back and told stories that they remember. But during Florence's, her last days, the community came together to support her as well. Her health was failing, and there's a gentleman who still lives on York Street who tells me stories about how when he was a little boy, he remembers his mom sending him across the street with meals to deliver to Mrs. Higginbotham. And these are people from different status levels, different races, different backgrounds, people who have realized that at the end of the day, none of that stuff matters, okay? These are your neighbors, you know? And when we can get to the point that we look at the rest of our community as extensions of family, of self, I think that we have the opportunity to really work together a lot better and to thrive as a community. We have all these examples that we can look back at and refer to, and today, what we're living, I feel like no matter what we may be faced with on any given day, and we can look back and refer to this history that we came from, it doesn't matter how hard things may appear, we've got this. We can absolutely achieve whatever it is that we set out to achieve. So I encourage you all to learn more about this history and seek ways to apply it to your daily lives, because there are lessons there, and when we think about the way Nantucket's community is today, how tight-knit we are, this is something that whenever we're faced with new issues here, we shouldn't be disheartened, even when those issues may seem huge. I'm sure slavery seemed huge back in, the 1700s when Nantucketers were coming together and saying, not on our island. We don't want that here, I'm sure it looked huge when those bounty hunters showed up saying that, hey, this is federal law, okay? We're here to collect this guy. I'm sure that seemed pretty intense. Those people felt like, this is the government that could come after us, So these are big things, and yet these people were able to overcome them. So thank you again for having me today. I hope you will come over and visit the African Meeting House at some point. Our summer hours are 10 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday, Sunday 12 to 4. I am currently the only full-time staff person on the island, so I do appreciate your patience. Sometimes I do have to, take lunch and things like that. But I've been fortunate enough to be able to hire a part-time employee this summer. So if you get a chance to go over there in the afternoons, there will always be someone there. So does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Do you think the close-knit factor was just typical of islands, or do you think it was more unique here because of the Quakers?
I think the Quakers had a large part in that. There were a lot of contributing factors. the whaling industry was a huge contributing factor, you know. The fact that the whaling industry didn't discriminate. If you had skill, you were paid equal wages, you know. And the whaling industry was incredibly dangerous. So when these guys are out on these ships, you didn't have the luxury of saying, I'm only gonna work with somebody that looks like me. Like, I don't know what to tell you, you know, like you were risking your life out there. You had to figure out ways to work together. So those guys, I'm sure while they were out there, they were developing bonds, you know, and those barriers that had maybe previously been up, they come down pretty easily when you're right there together, and whatever you maybe previously thought, it's the same thing with here on the island, you know, living in somewhat close quarters to each other. It gets rid of that otherness pretty easily, you know. You see the way your neighbors live. You know, you see that they have the same fears and hopes and dreams and desires, and they care about their children in the same way. So I think there were a lot of different contributing factors. Quakers were huge, though. They use their voice, and that's something that is so important when you think about a community.
Principle, too.
Exactly. They had their principles, and they were willing to speak up when their voice needed to be heard.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Anybody else? All right. Well,
Thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you all.